Let us revisit some of the definitions that we have looked at. Once again, what is market equilibrium? It is the price at which quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Then we know what is a shortage. It is a situation in which quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, and this happens when the market price is lower than equilibrium price. Then there is a situation of surplus, a situation in which quantity demanded is less than quantity supplied, and this happens when the market price is higher than the equilibrium price.
Now what we get into is why do prices change and why does quantity traded change? And there are two things you should know about price change. This can happen when the market is not in equilibrium. This is the first thing we'll discuss. Why do prices change? And another aspect we'll look at is why do prices change when market is already in equilibrium? And once the market is in equilibrium, there should be no tendency for prices to change, and because equilibrium, the way we have looked at it, is pretty stable. Now here is the diagram that we have used in the previous lecture, and we know wherever demand and supply curves intersect, we have equilibrium, and this is that point. You bring this point to the vertical axis, you have determined price at equilibrium, which will be $3. You bring this point to the horizontal axis, and you have determined what will be quantity traded, and that too at equilibrium. So let us call price at equilibrium as PE and quantity traded at equilibrium as QE. And so once the market is at equilibrium, there's no reason for prices to change. But consider a price like PH, which is higher than equilibrium. And here at this price you find the demand is less than supply, or in other words, what you have is surplus in production. Another term is inventory buildup or simply excess supply. Now, when we have a surplus or the supply exceeds demand, in such a case, there'll be a tendency for prices to fall. And if they're allowed to fall, what will happen? The demand will increase at a lower price, supply will fall at a lower price, and this will go on happening till we hit equilibrium. So whenever you have a surplus in the market, there'll be a tendency for prices to fall. And look at a price which is lower. Let's call this PL, a term that we have used in the past. And at this price, suppose this is $1 per cup, what you find is here demand is greater than supply, and what you have is a situation of shortage. Why shortage? Because demand is more than supply. Now in such a case, there will be a tendency for price to rise. Let me just change this. We have to show an increase in supply, so you can see this is the direction in which prices will change. So when the market is not in equilibrium, if the price is higher than equilibrium, chances are prices will fall, and as they fall, we'll eventually hit equilibrium point. And if the prices are too low, we'll have a shortage, And when we have a shortage, there will be a tendency for prices to increase. And as they increase, demand falls and supply increases. And this adjustment goes on taking place till we hit equilibrium. Or in other words, equilibrium, the way we have looked at equilibrium, this is a stable equilibrium. And if the market is not at equilibrium, it has a tendency to come back or revert to equilibrium. So the first reason as to why prices change is simply when the market is not in equilibrium, and if for some reason the price happens to be higher than equilibrium price, in such a case there will be pressure for prices to fall, and if they actually fall, we'll eventually hit equilibrium. And a similar kind of reasoning applies to a situation when we have a lower price. Now we answer the second part, and that is, if the market is already in equilibrium, why would prices change? And here what we are getting into is an area called comparative statics, where we are comparing outcomes under two or more equilibrium points. And why do prices change when the market is already in equilibrium? This could happen because of shifts of demand or supply curves. And what we'll do subsequently or next is look at increase in demand, what are the consequences of that, an increase in supply, and then the opposite of that, and then a combination of A and B. So let us look at each of these one at a time. Now here we have a diagram that we have used in the past, and that shows market equilibrium. We know E0 is the equilibrium point, PE0 is price at equilibrium in the original situation, and so the subscript 0 represents the original situation, and now we have quantity traded at equilibrium again in the original situation. Now suppose for some reason the demand curve shifts to the right, and we have this new demand curve, and let us call this D1, the original demand curve being D0. And now what we have is a new equilibrium point E1. What is the price at this new equilibrium point? It will be given by this new point of intersection. What will be quantity traded at new equilibrium? It will be given by this line. And so what we have is a new price at new equilibrium, PE1, and new quantity traded at equilibrium, QE1. So what we find is when the demand curve shifts to the right, or there is an increase in demand, what will happen to price? It will increase. What will happen to quantity traded? It will increase. So from this diagram we know an increase in demand, other things being equal, will cause an increase in equilibrium price and an increase in equilibrium quantity traded. And so one of the reasons as to why price may change is because of demand curve increase. Just look at the opposite of demand increase. I do not have to draw a diagram for this. You can try this on your own. When demand falls, what will happen to equilibrium price? We would expect equilibrium price to fall. And what will happen to equilibrium quantity traded? Again, we would expect this to fall. So when demand curve shifts, prices and quantity traded change. And when there's an increase in demand, both in equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity traded increase. And if there's a decrease in demand, there's a decrease in equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity traded. Now let us look at supply side shift. And we already have the original situation, original equilibrium point denoted by E0, original price, original quantity traded. Now suppose for some reason the supply curve shifts to the right and we have a new supply curve, and let us call this S1, and this of course is S0. Now we have a new supply curve, and what this is an increase in supply, and so now what we have is a new equilibrium point E1, and with this new equilibrium point we can determine how many quantities, or what will be the quantity traded of coffee and what will be the new equilibrium price. So let us write PE1 to denote new equilibrium price and QE1 to denote new equilibrium quantity traded. And so let us just show this. So what we have is, when there is an increase in supply, you find a decrease in equilibrium price. What happens to quantity traded when supply increases? It increases. So let us just write this down, and that is, an increase in supply, or a rightward shift of the supply curve, will cause an increase in equilibrium, a decrease in equilibrium price, and an increase in quantity traded. So price and quantity traded move in opposite direction when we are looking at a supply side shift. Now look at the opposite case. You can work on this on your own. When there's a decrease in supply, what would you expect? Take a moment to reflect on this. You would expect an increase in equilibrium price and a decrease in quantity traded. So once again, whenever there is a shift of the supply curve, the price and quantity traded will move in the opposite direction. To summarize, when there is an increase in demand, there is an increase in equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity traded. And when there is an increase in supply, there is a decrease in equilibrium price and an increase in quantity traded. Now suppose both demand and supply curves increase at the same time. What can you expect? Both of them have done so. One thing we know for sure is there will be an increase in quantity traded. What will happen to prices? We just do not know. It will depend on the relative strength of the demand side shift and the relative strength of the supply side shift. And for example, if increase in demand, howsoever measured, is greater than increase in supply, demand side factors outweigh the supply side factors, and we would expect an increase in equilibrium price. If on the other hand, increase in demand equals increase in supply, we would expect no change in equilibrium price. And if increase in demand is less than increase in supply, we would expect a decrease in equilibrium price. And this completes this lecture. Thank you.